Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. We will get started as people continue to filter in. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar on state-led solutions to tackle food waste and methane emissions from landfills. My name is Olivia Alves. I'm a senior associate at RMI, working on advancing ambitious climate policy in the US with a focus on waste sector methane. Next slide, please. We are so excited that you have all joined us here today to talk about some of the low-hanging fruit strategies that can help reduce landfill pollution, create economic opportunity, and benefits for communities across the United States. The goals of today's webinar are to examine the latest state-level emissions data and how landfills can easier tackle landfill and other sources of methane, to dig into the regulatory process from leading states on how to cut methane emissions while delivering powerful co-benefits, and how to learn that states can take advantage of federal IRA funding and various opportunities to reduce emissions and benefits for impacted communities. We have a great lineup for you today. We'll start off with opening remarks from our special guest, Gina McCarthy. Then Catherine Blauvelt, the Circular Economy Director at Industrious Labs, will provide an overview of landfill methane emissions. Then we will move on to a state solutions panel where we have great speakers coming in from across the US, led by Leah Guccione, the Managing Director of the US program. At the end, we will have time for a Q&A with our panelists and wrap up with some actionable next steps. As a reminder, you can submit questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A function on your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the Q&A portion, and we will also be recording today's discussion, posting it to YouTube. At the end, we will also be following up with slides, resources, and the recording for attendees after the event. I will now hand it off to Leah, the Managing Director at RMI's US program, who will moderate our state panel and introduce our opening speaker remarks. Thanks,
Thank you,
Leah.
Olivia. It's great to be joining everyone today to talk about methane. It's really my pleasure to be able to introduce our special guest, Gina McCarthy, who's going to share some opening remarks with us. Gina, as the first White House National Climate Advisor and former US EPA administrator, is one of the country's most respected voices on climate change, the environment, and public health. Her leadership has led to some of the most ambitious action on climate in US history, with new job creation and unprecedented clean energy innovation and investments across the country. Gina's commitment to bold action across the Biden administration, along with the help of historic legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, has restored U.S. climate leadership on a global stage and put our climate targets back within reach. Gina is now also the managing co-chair of the America's All In Coalition. Gina, we're so glad to have you. Welcome, and over to you.
Leah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I am still very jealous of your backdrop there. So welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be with you to talk about the major opportunities that we see today to reduce methane emissions from the waste sector through state-led policies. So today, we're going to be talking about trash, because trash is a big contributor to climate change. You know that when food waste and yard waste and other organics are buried in landfills, they release methane, which is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide at warming the planet. Did you know Americans throw away a third of their food every year? And methane emissions are responsible for about 1/3 of the warming impacts we're experiencing all across the country right now, from wildfires to record heat to flash flooding. Look, our landfills are also the third largest source of methane in the United States. In fact, actual emissions from landfills are equivalent to driving 66 million gas-powered cars or operating 79 coal-fired power plants. You know, today's aircraft and satellite technology allow us to actually see methane leaking from our landfills all the way from space. And beyond this planet warming methane, you know and I know that landfills also emit hazardous air pollutants, dangerous gases, and odors that impact the health and well-being of people living nearby. Communities that are often disproportionately low income and communities of color. So what can all of us do about this urgent climate and environmental justice challenge? Well, we need upstream efforts. We need upstream efforts to keep organics out of landfills. And we need downstream efforts to reduce the dangerous methane that is leaking from all the waste already buried in these landfills. With your help, we can drive collective action, because that is what it's going to take to cut methane emissions from the waste sector. And this is so important, really, for so many reasons. Because with your help, we can tackle the structural racism and inequities that have been holding so many communities back who live near these landfills. And we can reduce food insecurity and health risks, and we can create lots more local jobs while producing value-added products like feedstock and compost. Look, instead of creating harm by burning or burying waste, we have the opportunity today to create so much good for our communities, especially those that have been left behind. And the time is now. It seemed clear to me anyways, and I think to many of you, that states are well poised to tackle landfill emissions and waste. After all, in most states, a municipal solid waste landfill is the single largest source of industrial methane emissions. And we all know that cutting methane is one of the strongest levers that we have to slow the rate of near-term warming. So it makes absolute sense to focus on organic waste and landfills as part of every single state strategy. You know, a number of states are already leading the way, and you'll hear from panelists today who are taking action now. First, by updating their regulations to better control emissions from existing landfills, because we have proven cost-effective practices and technologies that can allow that to happen. Second, through policies that prevent new emissions from being generated, like organics recycling, that creates powerful benefits for communities, and policies focused on food waste prevention, like edible food donation, and even just better reporting and organics diversion requirements. And finally, you'll hear about why this is such a great time to take action to reduce waste emissions, thanks to new funding in the Inflation Reduction Act that can help support your efforts. In fact, the EPA just recently announced competitions for $4.6 billion in climate pollution reduction implementation grants. And it's really exciting, especially if every state includes waste measures in all of their plans. You know, in this critical moment, when we have such opportunity and we have such access to funding, it's time to move landfill emissions higher up in states' list of priorities, not just because of all the harmful pollution emitted in the solid waste sector, but because it will help tackle environmental justice. It will put people back to work. It will lower global warming emissions, and it will give our children and our grandchildren a cleaner and healthier today, as well as a brighter and more stable future. I'm confident that if we work together, we can make much needed progress in reducing methane emissions from our solid waste sector. Today, we not only have the will to succeed, we have the path forward. The opportunities are clear and in front of us. So now is the time. Thank you for listening, and thank you so much for joining in this important conversation today.
Thank you so much, Gina. So inspiring, and really appreciate your perspective on this incredible opportunity. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Catherine, who will give us an overview on what we're really seeing and what really is the opportunity to tackle landfill methane emissions. Catherine?
Great. Thanks, Leah. I'm Catherine Blauvelt, Circular Economy Director with Industrious Labs, and I'll share with you a short presentation giving an overview on landfills, waste emissions, and the benefits of taking action. Next slide. Next slide. Great. So as you can see, there are lots of benefits for taking action. Yes, there are immediate benefits on climate, but when you don't burn or bury waste, there's so many more benefits. Just highlighting one example on jobs, Gaia put out a report, Zero Waste and Economic Recovery, that studied jobs data from 16 countries. And it found that composting and semi-mechanized recycling can create many times more jobs than landfilling or incineration. And that intuitively makes sense, right? When you think about it. And those alternatives can provide more stable employment and higher wages. And that's obviously what we want, is safe jobs and family sustaining wages. So just as one example, let's dig in further to each of these opportunities you see. First, addressing global warming. Next slide. So one reason we're talking about this, as Gina just talked about, is looking for effective climate change solutions. The Global Methane Hub says reducing methane gas is the fastest way to address climate change in the short term. Even, a small reduction, incremental reduction in methane gas has an immediate positive feedback loop, right, to the climate. And this slide, of course, shows those US statistics estimating that 20-year global warming potential of total landfill methane emissions in the US. And these are big numbers. But we should know, like other methane emitters, landfill emissions are likely even higher than the current formula-based estimates. Columbia University study found 3 times the amount that is officially estimated. And that's in part because formulas we're relying on don't account for everything, right? Like the type of cover put on a landfill, or the differing actual efficiency levels in the gas collection and capture systems, right? So really at any landfill, you could be overcounting or undercounting emissions. And I know the EPA has an open docket on this subject to try to improve that inventory and the accounting. But when you zoom down to the local level, next slide, Industrious Labs looked at EPA data reported by industrial facility operators to the EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program, and found that in 43 states, municipal solid waste landfills have the largest share of methane emissions out of all other industrial sectors, excluding energy. So you see that represented here. I do want to note this is talking about emissions coming from landfills once organic waste is deposited, but every state has additional emissions that are coming from that food and organic waste before it gets into the landfill, right? Agriculture emissions, transportation of the food, right? That whole supply chain. So ReFed has a lot of great statistics on this. Uneaten food in the US consumes 6% of all US greenhouse gas emissions, 22% of all fresh water use, right? The statistics go on. So even more reason to take action. Next slide. So before I keep going, just a quick note on why landfills create methane. And you see here sort of the breakdown of organic matter. A simple way to think about it is bacteria is eating up the organic waste. And when that happens and there's no oxygen, it produces methane gas. There's certainly many other gases that are coming out of landfills. Methane production typically begins within the first year after the waste is disposed of, but it can continue on for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 or more years. So it's really these zombie landfills where the problem keeps going for decades. And incredibly, more food waste reaches landfills than any other single material, right, making up the landfill. So it's an estimated 24%, just a staggering amount. Next slide. Landfills leak. Leachate, methane, other air pollutants, and landfills are really dynamic, right? The production of methane can change depending on precipitation, how the landfill was designed, what's being added to the landfill composition itself. So it really requires constant vigilance and operational excellence for decades. So this is a really simple diagram of a landfill. Each red exclamation point represents a methane emission. And I don't have time to go through every single one, but One obvious example is just the need to install comprehensively and effectively run gas collection and capture systems, right? Any number of things can happen. The water can build up in the gas collection system, which harms the pressure system, right? Its ability to capture gas. And it may not be, capture systems may not be in every part of the landfill, right? We have national standards from the EPA that regulates some landfills, not all, and those standards require landfill collection systems, gas collection systems, to meet certain standards like destruction rate for methane. But there's room for improvement. The Environmental Integrity Project analyzed publicly available data and found that out of the top 10 highest emitting landfills in the country, okay, biggest emitters, 8 are required to install and operate gas collection systems following federal standards, right? So some low-hanging fruit there. And then another quick example is just ensuring we have effective monitoring to find those big methane leaks, right? Right now, our federal standards do not require that all of the landfill surface is checked for leaks, right? It's in a grid pattern of 100 feet, which is around a basketball court's length. And the working face or active face is excluded from monitoring. So that's where we stand now. Next slide. But every state has a different waste story. Industrious Labs created a 50-state interactive dashboard that displays down to the community level all reported methane emissions from landfills. So not all landfills, but the larger emitters. So you can click on a state, you see the website there, and see a map of the state with all landfill emissions reported, displayed, and you can also do some comparisons. There are limitations, and one is a state or a community could be producing the waste and exporting it elsewhere, right? And a number of states do that. So those emissions and the impact on communities show up in another community. Next slide. So communities are bearing the brunt of the environmental impacts: air, water, truck traffic, health impacts. You see some headline examples here, and we have some amazing perspectives today from all the speakers. I also want to acknowledge not all perspectives are here, particularly perspectives from the most impacted communities. And this isn't a complete discussion without that perspective. So our commitment is to facilitate more conversations beyond today. Next slide. And you can also see that structural inequities that are present in communities show up on this issue, right, in terms of who's disproportionately impacted by landfills. So it's critical to start with, how are communities centered in the solutions, right? Who is benefiting? Next slide. So you'll be hearing a lot about solutions today, and it's hard to share all of them, right, in one session. But this is a very simplified diagram to show that you really need to come at the problem from both angles, right? We have millions of tons of organic waste buried. We have to more responsibly deal with that. And there are proven strategies there. And then upstream, right? The most effective strategy is to never put that organic waste in the landfill in the first place, right? A quick example, in Massachusetts, the state's organic waste ban has supported diversion, right, from the landfill, and also supported over 900 jobs being created in different waste hauling and processing and food rescue, and generated almost $200 million in industry activity, economic activity. So big outcomes there. Next slide. So there's a lot that's possible. It's really about bringing attention and resources and effort to the issue. And the potential community benefits really coincide and will help you fulfill these timely IRA opportunities. As Gina indicated, those climate pollution reduction grants have multiple goals. And this is an issue where there are multiple benefits, just the same, right? Addressing dangerous climate pollution, delivering cleaner air, empowering community-driven solutions, and addressing those inequities. So with that, I'll hand it off. We'll start hearing from our panelists.
Thanks, Catherine. I'd like to go ahead and introduce the really great lineup of panelists that we have. So we have brought together some experts from across the United States to discuss their work reducing landfill methane emissions at the state level. We'll hear a brief presentation from each panelist, and then we'll have time to move into audience Q&A and really take your questions. First, we will hear from Darby Hoover, who is a senior resource specialist at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where she specializes in issues related to food waste reduction, composting, anaerobic digestion, plastics, zero waste, recycling, and paper industry reform, as well as sustainable packaging. She will talk about the upstream approaches to reduce and manage food waste. Then we'll hear from Dr. Jason Schroeder, who is an air resources supervisor at the California Air Resources Board, where Jason manages a team of climate and air quality scientists at CARB who use novel measurement technologies to better understand air pollution and greenhouse gases in California. And Jason will talk about what California's landfill methane regulations and remote sensing activities are. Then we'll hear from Nick Lapis, who is the Director of Advocacy at Californians Against Waste. Since 2007, Nick has led CAW's team of advocates in campaigns, research, and policy development to pass groundbreaking laws that have positioned California as a global leader in reducing and recovering waste. Nick will share with us the exciting Nick will tell us about an exciting current funding opportunity to finance this work. Then we'll hear from Randy Mosher, who is the Deputy Program Manager of the Air Quality Planning Program at the Maryland Department of Environment. Mr. Mosher works on the analysis, development, and implementation of strategies to control emissions from sources of air pollution and greenhouse gases throughout the state of Maryland. Randy will talk to us about landfill emissions in Maryland and their ambitious new rule that has been put into place. And then to wrap up our presentations, we'll hear from Emily Ranson, who is at the Chesapeake Regional Director for the Clean Water Action and Clean Water Fund, where she oversees regional programming and leads the Maryland legislative agenda, with a particular focus on organic waste diversion and septic systems. Emily will talk to us about the importance of addressing landfill emissions, organics diversion, and who you can partner with. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is going to be Darby. Or Olivia, you're going to transition to Darby?
Yeah, I'm happy to transition to Darby. Thanks, Leah. We'll start it off with Darby Huber from NRDC to talk to us about upstream approaches to reduce and manage food waste. I'll hand it off to you, Darby, in the next slide.
Thanks, everybody. Next slide. NRDC, and next slide after that. NRDC has been working on food waste reduction since 2012, when we helped spark a national dialogue about the alarming amount of food that goes to waste in our country by releasing the report, Wasted: How America is Losing Up to 40% of Its Food. We do federal and state advocacy. We do a lot of work with cities, which we call our Food Matters Project. And we work on the household level, including through our food waste awareness campaign for consumers, which is called Save the Food. Next slide. We use a simplified version of EPA's food recovery hierarchy, in which we prioritize prevention solutions, which are keeping food from going to waste in the first place, then feeding people through donation and rescue, and then recycling, feeding animals and feeding soils through organics recycling. So this pyramid represents the economic, environmental, and social gains associated with each strategy, and it's weighted accordingly. The greatest gains are at the top. But the order indicates a priority of strategies, but doesn't always reflect a realistic approach on the ground, where often efforts will start with organics recycling and then work on different tiers may go on simultaneously. The hierarchy is primarily useful for ensuring that we don't over-allocate resources all to one tier, like organics recycling, but that we allocate resources to each of these tiers, keeping in mind not just ease of implementation, but overall benefits. Next slide. Just as we need to act across the food recovery hierarchy, we need to think comprehensively about how to tackle climate change. The need to reduce climate emissions is urgent. The strategies to tackle short-term climate pollutants are critical. We have to act on all fronts simultaneously and immediately, including tackling emissions from waste in place, which many of the other panelists will address. But we also need to look at where methane and other climate pollutants come from. As Catherine said, landfills produce methane because there's organic waste in them. Obviously, we can't remove all the organic waste that's currently in landfills, but we can mitigate those emissions, and we can work on reducing future emissions by reducing the amount of organic waste that gets disposed or even generated in the first place. Next slide. So how does NRDC tackle these issues? Through many different strategies working at different levels. Earlier this year, NRDC and partner organizations at the bottom of this slide launched the Zero Food Waste Coalition, which is a national effort focused on informing and influencing policy primarily at the federal and state levels. It brings together consumers, businesses, and government, and currently the coalition consists of over 100 member organizations. I'm going to speed through these slides. There's a lot of content on them. That's because I hope you'll take them home and study them in depth afterwards, and I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested. One highlight on this slide, number 4, federal funding for state and local efforts is critical. And note that climate funding can be food waste funding. So think about what infrastructure you'd like to build out, prevention, rescue, recycling, that can help reduce food waste, and that reduces climate impacts. Next slide. Why do we focus on cities? In the US, cities are the ones primarily responsible for funding and setting up waste management infrastructure. So working on food waste can mean that cities manage less waste and pay less money to do so. They can potentially have more food relief to help them fill their meal gaps. And they can also get closer to reaching their climate and sustainability goals. So NRDC's goals in working with cities include on-the-ground change, but also inspiring cities to influence one another and to support cities to be leaders, including at the state and national levels. Next slide. We've produced a number of tools and a body of research to support municipal food waste reduction, including our policy and program toolkit, which includes a range of policy and program options across the hierarchy that cities and other partners can use to reduce food waste, and which supports informed decision-making about what strategies may be most feasible and effective in their communities. Next slide. Another resource we're providing at the municipal level is creating model policies, which often can be adapted for state use, like this sample compost procurement policy. I also want to mention that Environmental Law Institute has a toolkit for incorporating food waste reduction strategies into municipal climate action plans, and that may also be applicable at the state level. Next slide. While cities are valuable partners for us, state policies are essential in providing incentives and in providing clarification and sometimes barriers that can affect municipal strategy development. So as an outgrowth of our Food Matters project, we compiled inventories and gap analyses of 10 categories of food waste related policies in the 12 states representing our Food Matters Regional Initiative participants. Next slide. The goal of these reports is to equip cities, states, and policymakers with a comprehensive overview of their state's respective policy landscape and how it helps and/or hinders efforts to reduce food waste. Our hope is that these inventories and analyses can provide an overview of where individual states have already taken action and where there are opportunities for additional steps. These are the policy categories which represent areas across the food recovery hierarchy. We currently have 13 reports for different states. Next slide. And to further accelerate progress at the state level, earlier this year, the Zero Food Waste Coalition released a state policy toolkit with the goal of empowering officials and advocates from across the country to learn from one another's successes and accelerate their own leadership and impact. Next slide. This toolkit has a range of tried and tested policy opportunities, as well as model legislation templates that states can use to prevent food waste and keep food waste out of landfills and incinerators. The target audience for this toolkit is state policymakers and advocates, but it may also be helpful to a wide range of individuals and groups interested in enacting legislation to tackle food waste at the local, state, or federal level. Next slide. And here's a breakdown of each section from that state policy toolkit, which you can find by visiting the Zero Food Waste Coalition website. And the other resources I mentioned are all available on nrdc.org/foodmatters. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Darby. Now I will hand it over to Dr. Jason Schroeder from CARB to talk to you about California's landfill methane regulation and remote sensing.
Thank you, Olivia. So I'll start out with a very high-level overview of the legislative basis for our methane regulations in California. Over the past decades, we've had a handful of bills that have directed the state to meet greenhouse gas emission targets. The most recent bill, which is relevant for this workshop, is Senate Bill 1383. This bill requires a 40% reduction in methane emissions from 2013 levels by 2030, and it also requires reductions in other short-lived climate pollutants as well. Notably, SB 1383 also requires 75% organic waste diversion in California. Next slide. So next, we'll zoom into landfill methane policies in California. CARB's Landfill Methane Regulation, or LMR, was enacted in 2006 in recognition of the opportunity to achieve immediate, cost-effective greenhouse gas reductions by controlling methane emissions from municipal solid waste landfills. In addition, the state has established the intent to phase out landfilling of organic waste and is currently implementing regulations to reduce organics waste disposal in landfills pursuant to SB 1383. Statewide regulations requiring collection of organic waste became effective last year, and those efforts are ramping up to enable expansion of organics recycling infrastructure in the state. The need for additional action to directly control methane emissions was evaluated in CARB's 2022 scoping plan update in consideration of the state's stringent targets to rapidly reduce methane emissions. Finally, landfill methane policies are built upon research and technology, which has greatly improved in the past decade. We now have a better understanding of landfill methane emissions and effective reduction strategies than we ever have before. With more than 10 years of experience implementing the LMR in California, CARB has identified some opportunities for improvement in consideration of new technologies, lessons learned, and the state's ambitious methane emissions reduction goals, as discussed earlier. Some examples of the concepts that are being considered in our LMR update are leveraging advances in next-gen emission monitoring technology, ensuring effective mitigation of surface emission exceedances, and minimizing emissions during gas collection and control system disruptions. Next slide, please. So my remaining slides will highlight one of the next-gen monitoring technologies that's being championed by CARB. This technology is what we refer to as methane plume mapping, which uses remote sensing to detect enhancements of methane at very fine spatial scales. These sensors provide what we call methane plume images, an example of which is shown here, taken at a landfill in California. Here, the colors represent methane concentrations from low in dark blue to high in yellow. In this example, we can easily pinpoint a likely location for a large, localized source of methane on this landfill. But you can also note in this image that this technology only sees methane near the emission source and cannot detect the diffuse kind of area-wide sources of methane that exist over the rest of the landfill. So for this reason, this technology is not something that we consider appropriate for monitoring the total methane emissions from landfills, but rather we see this as a technology that is something that can help pinpoint areas of landfills that may be in need of further inspection and may have mitigatable emissions. Next slide, please. CARB has contracted to have plume mapping sensors flown over the state multiple times over the past 7 years. The first set of research projects were conducted with NASA JPL and are what we call the California Methane Survey. From this, we learned that methane plumes are prevalent across multiple sectors, including landfills. 3 follow-up research campaigns were conducted in 2020, 2021, and 2023 in partnership with the University of Arizona and the nonprofit Carbon Mapper. These campaigns were designed to take the next step and test how effective these plume mapping data could be in supporting mitigation rather than just studying emissions. During these 3 flight campaigns, when plumes were detected, we used the general methodology outlined here to get the plume images into the hands of operators as quickly as possible. Based on the responses that we received from operators, about half of the sources that we found with methane plume mapping were able to be mitigated, often within a few weeks of detection. The detailed results of these surveys are published in an online summary report. Next slide, please. So these methane plume mappers have demonstrated a viable use case for supporting methane mitigation in California, including from landfills. However, these infrequent flight campaigns are not sufficient to drive long-term sustained methane mitigation. And so for that, CARB is looking towards satellites, which can provide similar data, but much more frequently, perhaps daily, weekly, or even monthly, depending on the area. CARB is involved in 2 efforts on the satellite front. The first is a public-private partnership involving CARB, Planet, Carbon Mapper, NASA JPL, RMI, and others. As a part of this consortium, CARB will play a key role in validating the data quality and demonstrating the use of the satellite methane data for mitigation purposes. And this partnership plans to launch its first satellite in the coming months. The second effort that CARB is involved with is a bulk purchase of satellite data from a commercial satellite company. $100 million from the state's budget was allocated for this purpose, and that money will be awarded through a competitive RFP with multiple bidders. The RFP for this is actually currently live. So we hope that our work with methane plume mapping sensors can help spur other motivated jurisdictions to make use of this type of data for mitigation purposes. As part of this project, CARB envisions working directly with other jurisdictions to expand the usage of this type of data and increase mitigation, which ties broadly into California's goal of being a global climate leader. So with that, I will say thank you and pass it back to you, Olivia.
Thank you, Jason. Now we will hear from Nick Lapis at Californians Against Waste about opportunities to finance this work. Over to you, Nick.
Good morning, Nick Lapis with Californians Against Waste. Thank you so much for having me. It's a fantastic panel, and I'm glad that so many folks are joining to have this conversation. A moment about our organization. We're a nonprofit based in Sacramento working on environmental policy, specifically around waste reduction and recycling. I want to touch on a few of the things that you've already heard, but maybe in a little bit more detail, but really with the perspective, next slide, but really with the perspective of how this can be replicated in other places. And given the short time of this presentation, I'm only going to barely touch the surface, but I do strongly encourage folks in other states to reach out to me and CARB and NRDC to really get into the weeds on this. So as was mentioned earlier, our journey with methane reduction and waste as part of climate change started in 2006 with the passage of AB 32, which was our landmark greenhouse gas law that basically said that the state needs to get down to 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020. And it was ultimately achieved actually 4 years ahead of time. But next slide. If you look at the implementation of the bill, it wasn't just cap and trade, it wasn't just direct regulation, it was kind of a combination of everything. And the way the bill was structured is that CARB was charged with first finding the lowest hanging fruit they can possibly find and implementing that before they even get all their reporting back, before they develop a scoping plan or an emissions trading system or anything like that. And as part of that, CARB identified landfill emissions as one of 3 discrete early action measures. So this was literally the first thing that the state did to reduce climate change. And the reason for that is that there's some very, very low hanging fruit here. Catherine mentioned the overall standards, have a walking distance of 100 feet, right? Or 100 meters, I apologize, 100 feet. I apologize. But if you change that number to 33 feet, you're much more likely to stumble upon a source of methane emissions. Same thing with if you require methane capture at smaller landfills. If you reduce some of the numbers from higher thresholds to lower thresholds, they're very easy changes that are very low hanging that can have a very big impact and can be pretty cost effective. Next slide. And I think this probably goes without saying, but we're talking about methane here. So tackling methane early pays dividends into the future. A pound of methane reduced today is not the same as a pound of methane reduced a year from now, because of the great impact it has on the climate in the short term. Next slide. So as part of CARB's efforts to look at short-lived climate pollutants and methane reductions, they started off by saying we need to tackle landfill methane, but very quickly came to the conclusion that really the only way around these methane emissions is to keep organics out of landfills to begin with. Next slide. Now, before I get into the organics diversion, I did want to also touch on the satellites and the amazing opportunity that they offer. Next slide. And when I say satellites, it really isn't just satellites. We're talking about aircraft flyovers, we're talking about drones. We have an ability to find methane emissions much faster and much greater certainty, and react much faster than we did when the California regulation was being written in 2010. So I strongly encourage other states to also look at incorporating remote sensing technology into their landfill gas regulations. But even before they do that, do what CARB did, which is buy access to this data and remediate the plumes that you see as soon as you see them, because it takes a long time for walking a 100-foot serpentine pattern on a landfill to stumble upon a leak. And we have an opportunity for almost real-time response. Next slide. But again, landfill methane is just the tip of the iceberg, or the Weissberg. We have a lot of other reasons why we need to keep organics out of landfill. One that Darby touched on in pretty good detail is edible food recovery and edible food waste. You might have heard the statistic that if food loss was a country, it would have the third greatest greenhouse gas emissions after the US and China. Next slide. And obviously that becomes incredibly shocking, both as an environmental outcome and as a societal outcome, when you factor in the fact that so many of our neighbors are food insecure. The most recent data shows that in California, it's actually up to 1 in 4 people are food insecure. So we're throwing away nearly half of what we grow while people go hungry. And so environmental outcomes aside, that is not an okay societal outcome. Next slide. There's also the benefits of compost and what you can do with the material you divert from landfills. Again, we're talking about avoiding methane emissions, but when you take this material out of the landfill and you process it either aerobically in a compost facility or anaerobically to make biofuels and then subsequently compost it, you also end up with a product that sequesters carbon when used, but also helps make soil more drought resistant, reduces the need for pesticides and herbicides, has a litany of other benefits, both greenhouse gas related and otherwise. Next slide. So this was touched on earlier. California actually passed about a dozen different bills on organic waste. The most notable and probably the biggest was SB 1383, which set targets for reducing the disposal of organic waste, among other strategies for short-lived climate pollutants. The specific targets in the waste sector were an overall 75% reduction in organic waste disposal and a requirement that 20% of edible food be recovered for human consumption. And the state is in the process of implementing that now. The regulations were written and now they've been turned over to local governments for implementation. And local governments throughout the state are rolling out both composting programs, residential and commercial, and food recovery programs. Next slide. There's a lot that goes into that implementation, and there are a lot of complementary policies and a lot of things that need to be done. And I really hope we can help share California's experience and encourage folks to replicate it. So far, it has resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in California and real tangible jobs and real tangible environmental and economic benefits. And one of the lessons I've really stuck with for the last few years has been that you really need all the tools in the toolbox. You need large-scale urban collection program, 3-bin collection programs. You need small community composters on bikes. You need farm composting. You need healthy soils programs. You need to support food banks and food recovery organizations. You need to do food waste prevention. You need to do strong education and outreach. You need to invest in things like anaerobic digesters as well. Next slide. And on investment, we have actually spent a lot of money in California investing public funds into organic waste diversion, and prevention. And we have something called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund in California, which uses money from the state's cap and trade system to invest in greenhouse gas reductions. On the left is a chart of the greenhouse gas cost effectiveness of different programs that have been funded through that program. And you see that the waste reduction organics programs are really by far the most cost effective. And we were talking $10 to $53 a ton of greenhouse gas reduction. And the most expensive ones go up to the thousands, or in one case, the hundred thousands of dollars per ton reduced. And you all have an opportunity to sort of replicate these same investments because there's money available from the federal government. As was stated earlier, there's $4.5 billion currently available from the Inflation Reduction Act for climate change investments. And this is low-hanging fruit. It is incredibly low-hanging fruit. And one last point is that the numbers on the left that show the cost effectiveness are based purely on avoided landfill emissions. That doesn't even factor in all the benefits of using material that would have gone to the landfill, whether it's as soil or as edible food or as biofuel. And next slide has my contact information. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Now we will hear from Randy Mosher at the Maryland Department of the Environment to talk about landfill emissions in Maryland and their recent rule. Over to you, Randy.
Thank you, Olivia. So I'm here today to talk about the recent regulation that Maryland has just adopted this summer, dealing with methane controls at municipal solid waste landfills. So this was all inspired from Maryland's efforts to address greenhouse gas emissions that really kicked off strongly in 2007 under an executive order from Governor O'Malley to form the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. This led towards some legislation in 2009 under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, setting goals to limit our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, which has further been strengthened, as I'll explain in the next slide. So this is the more recent legislation that came out. It's the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022. And it's a very ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goal for statewide greenhouse gas emissions to be reduced by 60% by 2031. And this is from our 2006 levels. So a very strong and ambitious goal. In addition to that, the CSNA, the Climate Solutions Now Act, also set the 20-year global warming potential for methane. And this is to sort of address, it accounts for the higher impact of these SLCPs like methane that have a higher global warming potential over a short period of time. And the landfill regulations and addressing methanes was identified as a very important and high priority to address during this process. Next slide, please. And I pretty much said, I think, previously, it's just the methane potency has been identified by a number of our previous speakers as just being 80 times more aggressive than carbon dioxide, and also just something that just is prevalent in a number of the sources in Maryland that I'll show in the next slide here. This is Maryland's 2020 greenhouse gas inventory. Inventories are something that's always being updated, and we're trying to always get the best information. Maryland went through a recent exercise, and we believe we greatly did update and improve this information, showing that methane was 15% of our greenhouse gas emissions currently. And of that 15%, it was identified as landfills, comprising 40% of those emissions. So under the, as I had pointed out earlier, the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, having a sense of this type of information really identified the 3 areas to target for methane emissions. And Maryland our first regulatory action on this was to address the methane emissions from the natural gas industry, the compressor stations in the transmission sector. That was our first regulation that we adopted in 2018. And wastewater management is another one that's been, from wastewater treatment plants, another area that's been identified. Prior to moving into landfills, Maryland next moved into another climate regulation addressing hydrofluorocarbons before we just finalized our landfill regulations, which we did start with a very early stakeholder process. We've been really working with the most of the landfills in Maryland are owned by counties, working with those stakeholders as well as the organizations that help the counties manage these facilities. So our next slide, please. So two important things when Maryland was going through our regulatory development. One was just to update our regulations to make sure that we incorporate the latest federal new source performance standards and emission guidelines for municipal solid waste landfills, and then also strengthen those regulations due to the need for us to achieve our ambitious climate goals. So we can move on to the next slide, please. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this just gives you an idea of how our regulations are structured to be more aggressive in a sense of lowering the applicability thresholds beyond what the federal regulations require. The waste in place standards and the methane generation rates all have different requirements based on the landfill status, whether it's active or closed, and its size in those various categories. And those essentially, the more stringent requirements, as some of our previous speakers had mentioned, is that Maryland's regulations do require that under certain conditions, a landfill may be required to do the 25-foot surface emission monitoring as opposed to the 100-foot walking patterns. In addition to that, as you're seeing, just the applicability standards are more stringent. And these regulations, again, it's important to point out the work that California had initiated by having their regs in place back in 2010. Maryland's regulations are based upon that and the more recent regulations that were updated by Oregon. So taking that into consideration, the differences that we have between landfills that exist on the West Coast as opposed to our landfills, and our own regulatory style guides of how we have to develop our own regulations. We did make some amendments to our regulations to kind of custom fit them for Maryland. Some of the other things that we made into our regulations that were a little more aggressive was the accelerated time frame. If a source is required to have to install a gas collection system, the process for designing, operating, and implementing it are all advanced, as well as the a shift towards enclosed flares for greater odor control, as well as destruction efficiency of methane. So next slide, please. And all this being said, if our regulations, once they become fully implemented, Maryland's expecting a 25 to 50% reduction in landfill gas emissions being reduced. And this is based upon I think the landfill contribution is 5 million metric tons CO2 equivalent. So a pretty good percentage reduced. And we're also kind of hopeful to see that there's a United States Climate Alliance is working on a model rule that we feel that could be very applicable for other states to pick up upon and implement these type of regulations into their state's controls for landfills. In addition to that, Maryland is also taking the both downstream, upstream approach. We do have our Land Management Administration dealing with zero waste initiatives and other factors that try to prevent trash from getting into the landfills in the first place. And there you go. That's a quick summary. Thank you very much, Olivia.
Thanks, Randy. Now we will hear from Emily Ranson at the Clean Water Fund about the importance of addressing landfill emissions, organics diversion, and who you can partner with to do this work. Over to you, Emily.
All right, thank you. So hi, everyone. Emily Ranson, and I'm really going to be talking about local level solutions that we can all be working towards. The really exciting thing about methane solutions is that there are many things we can do to reduce these emissions. And I'm really going to be focusing here on upstream solutions to prevent landfill methane generation by rescuing food when possible and sending the leftover waste to compost. So next slide. One thing we have in Maryland, and other states have it as well, is organic diversion through large-scale generators. The idea here was focusing on the largest generators of organic waste, those generating over 2 tons of waste a week, phasing down to 1 ton of waste a week. And what we want to see moving from this is more facilitation of food rescue. So our current legislation is a bit agnostic towards how diversion happens, but there is definitely a massive untapped potential for using this to get more food into the bellies of hungry people. We're also working on some of the behavior change aspects of things through school food waste reduction. Maryland last year funded grants to fund infrastructure and education. This is things like, doing food sorts, looking through the waste and doing that type of waste sort so you can really get good data about what type of waste, the profile of waste that schools are throwing out, especially in their cafeterias, or setting up things like share tables. So that way, if a kid is not using something, another hungry kid would be able to eat it. And this is really that two-pronged approach. So it diverts food waste in the schools from landfills into hungry bellies or into the soil through compost. And then it also teaches the next generation about food waste recycling. And next slide. A big prong of what we've been working on is expanding on-farm composting as an opportunity for compost generation and use. And what's really exciting about the potential for on-farm compost is that it immediately opens up a distributed network for composting so we can minimize trucking waste long distances, especially in a place like Maryland, where we have had a very strong smart growth and agricultural land protection development pattern through, we have tier maps, we have different practices and order. So what it means is there are a lot of farms near our populated areas. And so by opening that up, we can have small distributed compost network that is not hauling it all the way across the state, hauling it multiple counties away in order to get at a large municipal compost. And composting, it's not a new farm practice. Composting manure and animal mortalities is a long-standing practice, and adding food scraps opens up the opportunity for farmers to better dial in their compost blends, really getting nerdy with the carbon and nitrogen blends. And on the end use side, letting farmers generate more compost facilitates the substitution of compost for synthetic fertilizers, which on its own is also methane intensive. So the co-benefits of compost abound. And next slide. So what we have definitely learned in pursuing these solutions is that they really enable you to work with unique allies. So it's, groups who are really working towards ending food insecurity, to farmers. There are environmentalists. We, of course, are able to work with wonderful students, and then also small businesses. And next slide. But there are always challenges when pursuing compost, especially as a methane solution. So while many of us on this webinar, we're all excited about the myriad of benefits that compost has, whether we're trying to improve the financial sustainability of farmers in the state by allowing compost as an additional revenue stream or a substitution for more expensive synthetic fertilizers, whether we're trying to improve soil health, whether we're trying to sequester carbon in the soil, or are we just interested in reducing methane emissions in landfills. We may like compost for shorter transportation demands when using a distributed network or as opportunity for small business development. But there are barriers. Compost has a PR program, and many regulators are very nervous about expanding compost even at the small scale, whether it's fears about rats, odors, water pollution. Compost may be seen as a threat. And one of my first experiences with this was the very prevalent notion that if food scraps were separated out of the trash, there would be a rat signal sent out all across the mid-Atlantic to all of the rats, and they would descend upon Maryland. The idea being that rats were foiled if food waste was commingled with regular trash, but once separated, they would know. But so there are a lot of fears about compost, but we can all be working towards keeping our waste system local, closing that loop so the food we harvest from our fields gets eaten, the salvageable food gets rescued, and the leftover food waste returns to the soil to nourish the next round of crops. So next slide. What's exciting, there are many footholds in states to take action. You can be including food waste prevention and diversion in your climate action plans. You can have stronger state regulations on landfill emissions. And you can do things like in Maryland and other places, we're getting involved in the waste planning processes. And we've been seeing the expansion of curbside compost pilots to bring composting to more residents. And, coming back to really embracing that big, diverse constituency that's out there to work on this, from farmers, economic development, you name it. A lot of people are really excited to work with you on this. So I'll pass back to Leah.
Thanks, Emily. Those remarks were great. And I'd like to thank all of the panelists for everything you've shared about the specific work you're doing, the solutions that you're testing, developing, deploying, and thank you for bringing all of those solutions and ideas to our audience and our fellow participants. So to start, I'd like to start with a question that I'll invite Jason and then Darby to respond to, which is, when you're looking at a state's greenhouse gas inventory, the landfill methane emissions number might seem small compared to, say, coal plants, the power sector, or transportation emissions. But why is it important to prioritize landfill emissions mitigation? Jason, let's start with you, and then Darby, you're on deck. Oh, Jason, I think you might need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, double muted. I can give a little bit of scientific background for my perspective on this, and that is that not all greenhouse gases are created equal. Methane has what we call a very short lifetime in the atmosphere. It only lasts about 10 years or so. So if humans were to stop emitting methane today, methane concentrations in the atmosphere would go back down to pre-industrial levels, definitely within my lifetime, probably way before the end of my lifetime. We can contrast that with CO2, which has a lifetime of in the hundreds of years. And so if we totally cut off emissions of CO2 today, it would take generations before we can reach pre-industrial levels. So there's kind of this short-term benefit to tackling methane, whereby actions that we take today can impact the climate tomorrow, whereas for CO2, it's kind of a much longer time frame. So it's that short-term benefit versus for methane versus that long-term thinking that we need for CO2. And that's why methane is considered the low-hanging fruit. And in many ways, methane emissions from humans shouldn't happen. Methane is something that we use for gas and for fuel. So methane shouldn't be emitted in the atmosphere in the same way that CO2 is. So it's something that is easier to tackle in that respect. And I'll let Darby chime in with thoughts as well.
Thanks, Jason. In addition to everything Jason just said, putting organic materials in landfills is something every person can interact with. So I don't have the ability to go reduce emissions from my coal-fired power plant in person. I can write letters, I can, support policies, I can buy the energy mix from my provider, but everyone touches food, which is the most prevalent material in landfills, as Catherine said. Everyone relates to food. 40% of up to 40% of our food supply in the US goes to waste. 40% of that comes from households. So it really can be a very individual effort. And I think it's a low bar for engaging people in climate forward strategies. So having that as a way to shift culture and not just going for the highest amounts of greenhouse gases produced and focusing only on those targets. Again, everything has to happen at once. One of the things that needs to happen is looking at where we can take personal responsibility, and decreasing the amount of organics we put in landfills is something that can be participated on a number of levels.
What a great point, Darby. I really appreciate you thinking about and sharing this way we can really make the opportunity for climate action so personal with addressing landfill, methane emissions, and organic waste diversion. So the next question I want to share, I'm going to invite Emily and then Nick to respond to. So one of our participants said, I live 3 miles downwind from a large landfill that just applied for another expansion. It is located in a socioeconomic disadvantaged community. While the county has curbside food scrap recycling program, those are located in more affluent communities. How do we make sure that any policies and actions benefit all? So Emily, why don't we start with you, and then we'll hear from Nick.
All right. Well, so I assume that the curbside food scrap recycling program is a county-run program. And so one thing I would initially suggest is really advocating to the county the importance of applying programs like that with that environmental justice lens. And so really targeting the people who are suffering the most from the existing waste system and saying, you know, to your county, these are the people who need to be given first benefits of the new waste system.
Thanks, Emily. Nick, what do you think from your experience, and what would you counsel?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And it is a complicated question because, you know, we can set up all the organics collection programs and recycling programs we want, and that landfill will continue to have emissions for the foreseeable future. And so it's not like it's a magic bullet. But that said, I think one issue that I've seen in California is people wait for gigantic infrastructure to exist to recycle everything before they feel like they can implement a program. And there are a lot of other tools in the toolbox beyond the municipal run program that you're referring to. So there are things like community composting, which is a very small scale. It can happen at a community garden or an urban farm or a school. There are food recovery for animal feed programs. There's actually a company right now selling a device that dehydrates your food, and then you can ship it back for animal feed. And so there are a lot of options. And I think we run into a chicken and egg, no pun intended, chicken and egg dilemma with infrastructure, where we think we need huge infrastructure or we can't do anything. But there's a lot we can do even without having that infrastructure in place.
Thanks, Nick. That's actually a good segue to a question that I want to put to Darby, which is, we got a question from somebody in the audience around, what does prevention and rescue infrastructure look like for a local government?
Oh, I love that. So I referenced our policy and program toolkit for local governments, and I would suggest folks go to nrdc.org/food matters and check that out, because that offers some ways to think through how a local government could be involved in prevention and rescue efforts. Some of the examples that come to mind from that particular question include looking at ways to measure and set targets for how much food waste you're putting out there, so that you at least have a starting baseline where you can track your efforts against that. Looking at ways to set short-term and long-term reduction targets and develop the plan for ongoing measurement. And looking at ways that you might be able to change your waste system collection and financing in order to fund some of the prevention efforts. You can engage businesses and institutions as a government to prevent food from being wasted. You can also engage consumers. You can increase awareness and provide concrete strategies through our savethefood.com portal, for example, or any other kinds of web page. A lot of these strategies are pretty low-hanging fruit in the sense that they don't cost a lot. A lot of it is about education, doing something like providing web links, putting out social media messages and other types of messages that might reach varieties of communities. And then in terms of rescue, looking at whether there are any policy barriers that that prohibit or impede the safe donation of food, and looking at ways that there might be possibility to expand food rescue system capacity. So I'll note that cities have largely, many of them have stayed out of the food rescue effort and left that to nonprofits. But during COVID in particular, cities started to realize that the rate of hunger and was rising among the residents, and that cities could be involved. So we've seen cities do things like, for example, create a position called a food sourcer, where they connect potential donors with potential recipients. So that's just some of the examples, and you can find more on our Food Matters page.
Thanks, Darby. I'd like to now turn to a question that we received for Randy. And the question is, Randy, what were some of the barriers or pushback that you faced to advancing stronger landfill standards in Maryland? And how did you respond to these and frame the key benefits for your state?
It's clearly economic benefit impacts upon, again, most of the landfills within the state of Maryland are county owned and run. So the resources available for the county to allocate towards the potential of expanding a gas control collection system could be quite extensive. So that's something that we did have to take into account in developing the regulations. But as a statewide effort that we're all addressing methane and other climate pollutions, the benefits far outweigh the social cost and the costs that are going to it from the state. So from a state perspective, we're taking a look at it holistically like that. I did have some, let me see if I can pull it up again, actual numbers associated with that. And I'm never good at recounting things right off the top of my head, so you got to pardon the potential job impacts for 6,800 potential jobs coming into the state with the incursion of these regulations, and the climate benefit was, this is after full implementation of the regulations, upwards towards $28 billion. So quite substantial versus the cost of implementation. But for smaller counties with smaller resources allocated towards it, it was certainly something of consideration. But there's been sufficient time of building up towards this regulation. We feel that people have had that sufficient time of preparing budgetary concerns and things like that.
Did the state do any particular outreach or have any particular partnership initiatives with the counties as part of this?
Absolutely. And this is going back since 2017. The state has started our first stakeholder process, identifying impacted sources and starting a stakeholder process, but also working very closely through our Secretary's office and the Maryland Association of Counties, and working one-on-one with particular counties to identify a lot of issues, and a lot of other state partners and research assistants as well, coming through the University of Maryland, NASA, NOAA, a whole host of partnerships to identify, as well as our environmental community. It always provides some substantial research input that we're not always capable of developing in-house.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that, Randy. And such a great question. Now, we've had a couple of questions from participants related to this. And so I want to invite some combination of probably Darby, Emily, and Nick to respond. Could you compare home composting versus commercial composting versus landfill composting? And how does these different types of composting actually reduce methane production? Why don't we start with Darby, and then we'll kind of, as I see you all on my screen, we'll go left to right.
Great. So I'm going to ask folks to Google something, which is ILSR hierarchy, because Institute for Local Self-Reliance has published their version of the food recovery hierarchy, which breaks down the different tiers of composting that can occur. and prioritizes local solutions. So if you compost at home, the materials that you're producing as organic waste don't enter the municipal waste stream. This means you don't have to expend the costs, the truck power, the labor, et cetera, to come and pick up those scraps and process them. So that's something that is something cities can really get behind and provide resources for. Many cities will hand out free backyard compost units, for example. Community composting is a level up where you can have a compost facility at a school, a community garden, or other kind of local setting where people can bring their food scraps, maybe from the neighborhood, where scraps may be composted from a community garden, et cetera. Again, that reduces some of the burden on the municipal system to manage that waste. And it also brings together community. And many of those systems, for example, in Baltimore, there's a great system that provides jobs for at-risk youth that are working at that those different community compost facilities. And finally, industrial composting just enables you to work at scale. So again, unsurprisingly, if you listen to my presentation, I think all these things go hand in hand. I think we need all of them to really create resilience, to build community, to build jobs, and to get organics out of the landfill.
Thanks, Darby. Emily, what are your thoughts, or what do you think it's useful for our participants to know about this?
Yeah, so one thing that's important to remember with compost in your own backyard is that you're not going to get the temperatures needed for certain things, certain types of organic waste. Specifically meat, you cannot put in your backyard compost. And so while backyard compost, as Darby said, is great, you're not sending things into the waste stream, you don't have any transportation costs, it does require more labor for you. It also, requires that you have more attention to making sure that it's not entirely food scraps. You need to have some of that woody material in order to make sure that your pile is staying aerobic and oxygenated and is producing good quality compost. And the other thing, industrial, large scale, these tend to be more municipal systems. There are some private, but they tend to be a lot more expensive to get up off the ground. And so that's why we really like the potential for both community compost, but then also that on-farm compost as much smaller scale, more distributed. Those piles oftentimes are getting hot enough so they can handle things like meat. But, we're always concerned about contamination, and those are not going to be the places that are going to have necessarily can afford, the screening and things to deal with contaminations in the waste stream like an industrial system could.
Thanks, Emily. Nick, your thoughts?
I think those are great answers on the backyard versus community versus farm versus large scale. On the other part of the question about how composting actually reduces emissions, it's a pretty simple thing that we all forget to mention every time we talk about this. And it's always a question that gets asked. But when organic waste rots in landfills, there's no oxygen. And so it's anaerobic bacteria that break down the material. When the anaerobic bacteria break down the material, they release methane. The same material, if it's kept aerobic, like in a compost pile that's turned, or in maybe not a turned pile, but one that has oxygen flowing through it, it releases CO2. And so it's the same amount of carbon, but because it's CO2 instead of methane, the greenhouse gas impact is 86 times better. That's kind of the quick answer for how composting reduces emissions. And then there's a similar question in the chat about how biodigesters make a carbon negative fuel and why it's considered carbon negative. And that largely comes from the fact that if you were not recovering that material, it would go to a landfill that would have these emissions. And so in California, we have something called the low carbon fuel standard, which requires all fuel producers to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel that they sell. And so every type of fuel has a carbon intensity that's been calculated by CARB. Gasoline is 90 something, diesel is 90 something, and corn ethanol is in the 70s, and et cetera. And you keep going down, down, and down. And you get pretty low with landfill gas. It's actually in the teens, I believe, maybe your low 20s for carbon intensity. But if you take that same material and you keep it out of the landfill and you make a fuel out of it, you actually end up with a negative number. And so that's why we refer to it as a carbon negative fuel. And so all the carbon negative fuels in California's low carbon fuel standard are mostly from digesters from waste-based feedstocks that would otherwise generate methane.
Thanks, Nick. That's really helpful. And I know that we probably could spend a whole nother 90 minutes talking about the accounting methodologies and the fuel standards that go into this. While I have Darby and Emily on Spotlight, we had a question about, somebody said, is it true that we have about 60 years of fertile soil left globally? Why are we not transforming more organic waste into fertilizer and using regenerative farming? So why don't we start with Darby, if you're ready, and then Emily, we'll hear from you.
Sure. I have heard that statistic about 60 years. I think that I haven't seen science behind that. I think it's likely highly variable, but I do think it highlights what is a real and extreme problem, which is the problem of soil degradation that's happening partly because of things like monoculture farming, et cetera. So I think that is a very real question as to why we aren't doing more on regenerative farming and organic recycling. Honestly, I think it's because we have not gotten out of a throw away mentality, by which I mean, we think that once we discard something, it vanishes from the universe and is no longer impacting our lives. So we really think there isn't a way, and that we throw something away, it's gone from us and it's gone from impacts on us. Of course, that's not true. And of course, part of the problem is that we look at things like, oh, we're putting something in the recycling bin. We're done with that too. We've thrown that away, but in a good way. We're putting something in the compost bin, good way. But we have to really be thinking about what are the destinations for these useful materials and thinking about them as feedstocks rather than wastes. And if we think about them as feedstocks, then we think about where are they the most useful and how do we need to collect and process them so that they will be the most useful. So we have to do that. And we have to, just like with recycling, we have to drive the organics recycling system by buying recycled. We have to have compost procurement policies at the state, local levels that require governments and in some cases private businesses to implement compost use in any earth disturbing activity. So if we have those kinds of policies, that can really make a difference. And thinking about that as closing the loop on organics recycling.
Emily?
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind also with, if a farmer wants to substitute compost for synthetic fertilizers, is that compost is not the perfect little grain size or, however sized material that perfectly fits in the spreader. And all of that farmer's equipment has been designed over the last, 50 years in order to really facilitate that use of that perfectly controlled fertilizer. And so one thing we hear from farmers who would like to switch to compost is that they have to adapt their equipment, they have to get new equipment. And so there is a significant financial barrier in order to start substituting compost, even if it's something that they would like to do for their soils. The other thing that we as advocates and regulators have to really keep in mind is that importance of clean, high quality compost. And so you'll hear the nightmare stories about contaminated compost causing problems or biosolids when they're getting land applied. And if they are contaminated with something, that could be financially devastating to that farmer. So we as advocates, as regulators, need to really be making sure that there is a waste stream that is clean and that, the cleaner the waste stream, those composts should really be the ones targeting to replenish our soils.
Thanks, Emily. So we have time for one last question. And so I'd like to put this to Jason and Catherine. Could you please speak more to downstream methane reductions at landfills? Is it just gas collection and flares, or are there some new ideas? So Jason, why don't we start with you, and then Catherine, you can bring us home.
Yeah, I think I'll just piggyback on Nick's great explanation of the carbon cycle and anaerobic versus aerobic digestion. And so it's easy to think of flares as being wasteful. We're taking methane gas that's collected at a landfill and just burning it. But even by just doing that, we're just converting the methane into CO2. So something that would have happened if that organic material had decayed aerobically. But of course, there are other uses for that methane as well. Like Nick mentioned, the low carbon fuel standard that we have in California, and that methane gas, that landfill gas, can be used for burning to create power, can be used to power trucks. A lot of garbage collection trucks in different areas of California are powered by landfill gas. So there are uses for this landfill gas, and using it in those ways, obviously we get some work out of it before it gets converted back to CO2, but even just flaring it is better, significantly better than having that methane gas released. Of course, it all depends on how efficiently that methane gas is captured and making sure that there are no leaks in the system before its final endpoint.
Thanks, Jason. Catherine, what do you think our audience should know about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, we've heard about technology being a real game changer here, right? So it's now sort of that states can choose to have their regulations catch up, right, to some of the new opportunities. If we can move blood across, a mountainside to a remote hospital by drone, you can also fly a drone over a landfill, right, and detect emissions that way and then follow up. Other important aspects are really addressing cover. That's a real gap in our regulations today, and many states have the ability, without legislation, to relook and update their regulations. Cover does matter, and a lot of research has indicated that. And then you have the co-benefit of, remember, there's a lot of other gases that leave the landfill besides methane. You have a better cover, you can keep that down too, right? Start to address those odor issues and other quality of life issues. So cover is a big gap. And then finally, I'd say it might be surprising to folks, but just like regular checking gas collection and capture systems for leaks, right? Again, optimal performance. So that's another place that we can look in terms of low-hanging fruit, and states may have the ability to do that.
Thanks, Catherine. Great points. Well, I would like to thank all of our panelists who shared their experience and expertise with us today. So many great examples and so much great information. And Catherine, I want to pass it back to you as we thank all of our participants so that you can share a little bit about next steps and additional resources people should know about.
Great. Well, many, many thanks to everyone who's joined. We've had a great discussion, and I'll just recap from the question, sort of what we're hearing from participants, and that is a real interest in solutions from the community level up, right? And there's more we want to do in the future in opening up space to highlight those solutions and community voices. And also heard a lot of detail around, or questions around, the details, right? And that the details matter, right? And wanting to get that information so that you're dialing in policies that are actually implemented well and achieve the outcomes that people are looking for on emissions or on jobs or others. And that's really like the intersectional nature of what we're talking about here is also really exciting, right? We're talking about energy in one breath, agriculture in another, and people personally taking action on another side. So a lot of potential for actions at different levels. And then I just want to note here, besides that, we're looking at planning additional webinars, again, that are more focused, right, on different topics. RMI and Industrious Labs are shortly going to issue a guide focused on the climate pollution reduction grants, right? That is a large chunk of money that now most states and a lot of large metropolitan areas are planning around right now. They're required to do a priority climate action plan, and then there will be that implementation pot of money that Gina McCarthy talked about. So we're excited to provide this resource just to support states and territories, tribes, and metropolitan areas as they're planning how to think about emissions, how to waste emissions, how to incorporate that, and again, some potential strategies there. So we'll look forward to sharing that with you, and I'll rather turn it over to Olivia for final words.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and to all of our great panelists who have spoke to us today about this important climate issue. We will follow up with you via email with resources, next steps, this slide deck, and a recording of today's webinar for you to share with colleagues. We really appreciate you taking the time today to join us, and we hope that you are feeling inspired about the action you can take to combat waste sector methane. Thank you all and have a great day.